It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And this is our year-end edition. We are going to take a look at the 3 biggest stories of the year, and we're going to predict. We're going to put the Nostradamus hat on John Nash, and we're going to have him predict what he thinks the 3 biggest stories of next year will be. John, how the hell are you?
Good, sort of good. We'll see. I got a buddy here, a friend of mine. She's messing already with the show.
Oh, hello, Isla the cat.
Yes, I think it's because I'm sitting next to it. There's an open window nearby. She has to crawl past me to get to the sunlight. So
now, who's going to take care of her while you're away on vacation?
Well, first I got a couple of people. My brother will watch it for a while. My brother's girlfriend for a while. Then my girlfriend for a while. So.
Oh, well, that's great.
She's going through a lot of people.
But I bet they all love her.
They better. She comes number one. She's the priority list in the household. Her, then everybody else. And that includes me.
It's so shocking.
Yeah.
You know, John of last year would have never been this, but this is awesome for you.
Oh, I even last year I said it's an abusive relationship. It's a very abusive relationship between me and this cat that I didn't pick her. She chose me. I had no choice in the matter of accepting her. So.
But you love her just the same, and that's.
I'm not going to say it in front of her. She'll go to her head.
So let's get started. What is, in your opinion, of these 3 stories, and we will name them as we go, but what, in your opinion, is the top story of 2023?
Well, we're going to be focusing on it's an MMA site, Bloody Elbow, mostly, even though we cover some boxing. So we're gonna limit this to mixed martial arts only. Because there's some big boxing events, stories too. Saudi Arabia getting into boxing, what happened to PBC and Showtime, just the number of big fights that boxing made this year. But for MMA, our top 3 stories, the number one has got to be, I think, for this year, and people might be surprised how much we cover other stuff, but Francis Ngannou was the number one story for everything that he symbolizes and encompasses into the industry as well. I think he was the number one story of the year.
Keep going on why he was the number one. I mean, give us, for new listeners, give us a little of the history around this and why it was so important for this year and for fighters in general.
There's a lot of, repercussions going to come out of this. There's a lot of elements to the Francis Ngannou story. Important one is we had a champion, a UFC heavyweight champion, leaving the promotion. We have not had a fighter leave the UFC since 2004. Fighters have tried before, but the contracts are such that it's been impossible. So him leaving the UFC as the champion at the time, though the UFC will claim they stripped him, but really he had the right to leave before that. 2 is the fact that he could do it through the contractual changes that were done because the antitrust lawsuit. He had contractual changes that let him get out of his contract, something unheard of before. And as people listen to the show know, those changes, they've rechanged the contracts to make it a lot harder for anybody to follow Francis Ngannou's route. So he also got out of the UFC because of the contract. We had a bidding war some degree for him amongst MMA promotions. And so another big story is how much he got and what he got from PFL that signed him after leaving the UFC. He's got now close to an 8-figure guarantee. He's going to get, if he fights MMA, we don't even know if he's going to fight mixed martial arts in the future because he's really set so well in boxing because he has a contract that allows him to do both. It's very open-ended. He gets to keep all of his sponsorship. He gets all these rights. He gets sit on a board on the African PFL franchise. And then on top of that, like I said, he gets almost 8 figures guarantee. And if it does great, if he gets a big opponent in MMA, he's going to make boxing like purses. It won't be, if he fights Deontay Wilder, if they manage to do that in PFL, his deal is not going to be 8 to 10 million. It's going to be probably in several tens of millions of dollars because he gets such a big chunk of the revenue. So all those elements together, not even mentioning that he promised his opponent 2 million minimum. There's just so many parts of that story that's the number one story because we have never seen a UFC champion leave. We've never seen anybody get out of their contract that way. We've never seen people get the kind of contract he has in in MMA, and we've never seen, I guess, the potential that another promotion now has. Though he's no longer the number one because he hasn't fought so long. If he gets a good opponent, it's pretty plausible for him to be the number one heavyweight again.
Now, there is a part of this that matters, and that is that his boxing match with Tyson Fury went over so well that WBC actually ranked him at number 10. So I want to ask you, is it more important that he did so well against Tyson Fury, or is it more important that he, wrangled this deal with PFL?
Well, I think it's more important that he did well with Tyson Fury, but the PFL deal basically gave him coverage that no matter what happens with Tyson Fury, he's cared for on the MMA side. If he bombs in boxing, now he can always go back to MMA, right? But obviously the Tyson Fury deal, that he did so well against Tyson Fury, is the bigger deal for him, but also for PFL, because they now Ngannou, people said, oh, he's not a draw when he left the UFC and all that stuff, but he's the number one heavyweight, and now he's a known commodity in combat sports. He has a big name in combat sports, much, much, much bigger than when he left. So PFL has now signed not just the number one heavyweight at the time, the UFC heavyweight champion. They have a guy that's really well known in combat sports because what he did against Tyson Fury. And for Ngannou, he's an MMA fighter that did well in boxing, did very, very well, that close to, beating the heavyweight champion. And he has the option now. If PFL can get him an opponent and he goes back to mixed martial arts, he will make a lot of money. He will make more than probably any MMA fighter, even Conor McGregor, probably, if they can get a big enough fight for him. Or he'll get a boxing match. And Eddie Hearn was saying, and this sounds plausible, that they already have a deal in place that he'll fight Tyson Fury at the end of the year in boxing again, in which case because that deal he had the first time was a one-off deal. There was no extensive contract. He's going to be looking at tens of millions of dollars boxing again. So he's a winner on all fronts.
Absolutely. Let's get to first of all, let me ask you, are there any other elements around Francis Ngannou that we should look at before we move on to topic number 2?
Well, I guess the only element is the big one is, and this will go into topic number 2 as well, is who his opponent is. What can he really do realistically in mixed martial arts, because he doesn't have an opponent, right? There's plenty of opponents right now in boxing. They're going to have the word is Joshua and Wilder are going to box in the spring. So that's off the table now. But both those guys are potential opponents down the line for Francis Ngannou. People would pay to see that. He's got a Tyson Fury rematch plausibly in the future. There's other boxers. Saudi Arabia, the other thing is Saudi Arabia is so much into the Ngannou business, I think, because they're getting so much into heavyweight boxing. There's other opponents that they would pit him with, and they would pay him a lot of money just to make sure it's done with the Saudi government in Saudi Arabia. So I guess the question, that element goes with it. Is a Francis Ngannou going to be a one-off? Is he the only one that's going to benefit this way? Or are there other fighters that are going to be a possibly benefit like this in the future?
All right. Let's get into topic number 2, which is,
I would say the number 2 MMA story, again, might be surprising to some people that listen to the show, is the PFL, and specifically the PFL and Bellator together, that the number 2 MMA promotion.
Why is it so important right now?
Well, first of all, at the beginning of the year, PFL wasn't that important. They hyped themselves up as this major player, but really they exaggerate so much. Don Davis is very good at speaking hedge fund speak to try to get investors, but really they weren't selling tickets. Their ratings weren't that spectacular. They didn't have that many top fighters as much as they boast they do. They don't have really any compared to like the UFC or Bellator. So really they had not much going for them. But over this year, first they signed Francis Ngannou. So they've got the former UFC heavyweight champ, the guy that left, the lineal heavyweight champion of the world, is under their promotion contract. They signed Jake Paul, who has yet to do a MMA fight, but he has he's there potentially, and I think he's exaggerated as a pay-per-view star, but he's an attention getter. Let's put it that way. So they have elements they've signed over the year, which give them potential pay-per-view possibilities. On top of that, now they've renewed their ESPN contracts. They're going to stay on ESPN. They've now bought up Bellator, which is the other major story, because now there's a clear number two. Even though PFL's gate and ticket weren't great in the past, they bought up Bellator. They now they've acquired a bunch of ranked fighters, and we'll get to that in a second why that's important. And also, after signing Ngannou, people look at the ratings. Their ratings have gone up over the summer after Ngannou was signed. And I think that's part of the payoff, is that the attention that he brought, that the idea of the stories that they'd signed him, brought viewers to the regular shows. Their gates seem to be up. We'll see next year when they have bigger stars actually fighting how much their gates are up. But that's another big thing. So in other words, there seems to be some progress. I don't think they're doing gangbusters business. They're still losing money for their investors. They're not, but they're moving in the right direction now on that level. And with the acquisition of Bellator, and it's really a merger technically, because they didn't pay for Bellator. Bellator got shares percentage. They merged the two companies. They've acquired all these fighters. So when they try to put on pay-per-views next year, the big thing is, who can they put on pay-per-views? Now, Bellator guys don't sell. They're still making the pitch that they're going to get 50% of the revenue. They're basically pitching to UFC fighters, if you can get out of your contract, come to PFL. Well, the good news is, for some of the weight divisions, if a fighter, a champ, or a guy that's a draw in the UFC can get out of his contract and come to PFL, they now have opponents to put against them, where before they didn't. And so that's a big deal. The question is, because we saw with how, what they did after Ngannou left, can they get any of those fighters? Well, I guess that's leading ahead to, we'll get into part two on these questions. But for PFL, they just did a lot this year. And compared, in the past, one was the big talk and one has floated in the background, and PFL has now cemented themselves. Even though they were probably a distant second behind Bellator, they are now clearly the number two promotion, but still way, 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 way behind the UFC.
Will it stay that way?
In what sense? Stay what way?
Will it stay that the UFC is in the number one spot and about 35 miles back is PFL?
Well, short answer, yes. Long answer, I guess. Let's look what happens when we get to 2024.
Okay. All right. I do have another question here as far as Bellator and PFL. There were a lot of rumors about certain fights. For instance, Cyborg and Leah McCourt, and it was supposed to be at the Saitama Super Arena, blah, blah, blah. And then everything fell apart. Are we going to see more stuff like that until they get everything ironed out, or are we going to look at smooth sailing in 2024? Do you think that between now and then they will have ironed out all their little difficulties and wrinkles?
Well, I mean, part of it was they had a plan, and now the plan's gone because the Bellator of the past doesn't exist. So we're still gonna have a lot of problems. And we're gonna have problems for the next several months, because they're gonna have to cut the roster down. So there's fighters that'll probably be let go. They will have to. There's just between now and then. I don't want to give too much away because we'll get into 2024 shortly. But they'll have to cut fighters down. There's going to be fighters disappointed because they had plans with Bellator that no longer seem sensible with the new promotion. And then there's fighters that are going to be told that they have to go to PFL, and I don't know how many want to go to PFL based on it's a tournament model. So there's still going to be issues going forward for the next few months. But I think it's shortly thereafter, it'll be ironed out.
One more question on this.
Yeah.
There are guys out there, and I'm specifically looking at Darren Till. Darren Till left the UFC last year. He requested his release. They granted it to him, but we don't really know what kind of release he got. And I noticed that he's very picky and choosy with what fights he's willing to talk about taking on his social media. And there are always these influencer or crossover or karate combat, but never anything full on MMA. If he were to get an offer or whatever, could he realistically go to PFL?
Well, I don't know his contract. My guess would be that they didn't really fully release him. They let him. They gave him permission to go out and fight elsewhere, and he's still under UFC contract. And one of the stipulations then would be that he can't fight mixed martial arts, or that he has to get permission from them to fight mixed martial arts. So that's my guess. He's cashing in on boxing, kickboxing, whatever, everything but mixed martial arts to build up his confidence and get some money. I'm just guessing, but that's what it seems, because he doesn't seem to be in any interest really to shop around to the other MMA promotions.
Exactly. And I was just wondering if you could spitball on that, which you did. So that was perfect. So getting to topic 3, which ties everything together, I think. Let's break it down.
Well, topic 3 for this year, 2023, the biggest story in 2023 from my point of view in mixed martial arts was the antitrust lawsuit. Now, I'm sure a lot of people are saying, "Oh, John, how do you not have that number 1?" Well, I don't have a number 1 because it hasn't made an impact. There hasn't been a ruling yet really on it. All we've had is that there's been progress in it. But the progress has been so immense that it still has to be a big story. And that progress has been that we had class certification. So the judge granted the class certification to be class action, which pushes it forward, set a trial date for next year, and that the defendants appealed this to the Ninth Circuit, and the appeal was rejected. So we are going to go next year, most likely into a trial. So just that alone is, because of how big the case potentially is, makes it the third story. On top of that, there is connections because Francis Ngannou, because the UFC changed their contracts in 2017 because of this lawsuit, Francis Ngannou got out of the UFC, sign with PFL. None of that happens without this lawsuit. Also, we've had a bunch of discovery this year. So we have much more information about the UFC than we had in the past, all thanks to this lawsuit. I mean, we've had it in the past, some of it like wage share, but this year we have we know individual fighter payments. We know stuff more about their dealings, just a lot more what the owners exactly got as distributions, things that we didn't know for sure before. So this year was huge for us for information, especially the last few months, huge for progression on the lawsuit. And there's some repercussions in the industry because now fighters are more aware of what happened, and we had the Francis Ngannou situation. But I'm not sure. We didn't see many more Francis Ngannou's this year. There's a potential. Maybe Paulo Costa took advantage of the sunset provision. He was claiming he was, and he got a good deal. Apparently, sounds like, from my understanding, Miocic kind of took advantage of it, re-signed with the UFC, but got a great deal. So other fighters have taken advantage of it, but I think we're moving to the point where that sunset provision that Ngannou and some other fighters kind of took advantage of, we're into newer contracts that no longer have the same one. So we're not going to see the benefits of that we had in the past.
So we are moving in reverse contract-wise once again.
Yes, we had a brief blip there where people had a better contract because of the changes that were enacted because of the antitrust lawsuit. And now that's going reverse. And it's also, I guess, outside the UFC, because of all the promotions, Bellator probably had the best contract now. I mean, back 2014 under Rebney, they had the worst, but lately they've gone to it's not a great contract. But as we covered earlier when we went through the contracts, their contract has the least restrictive provisions. And so, and if you saw in the antitrust lawsuit, you had stuff like Phil Davis's contract talks about he can go fight with PBC Boxing or Glory Kickboxing while under contract if he wants to. Things like that. They specifically don't have a sponsor tax. Fighters get like a booth to sell their own stuff. Some of the fighters do at the events. All that stuff is in a Bellator contract. Well, Bellator is disappearing. Those contracts are going too.
So let's take a look now at what might be on the horizon for 2024.
Okay, we're going to go in reverse order for 2024. But in 2024, I would say if we look in the future, the third biggest story to look at for next year, the third biggest is Francis Ngannou again, right? Because next year we are going to see, can Francis Ngannou build off this year, right? Is he going to be an example to other MMA fighters that there is a potential to make a lot more money in this business, either by boxing, by showing, hey, listen, there's really no difference between very little difference between MMA and boxing. Why am I making this fortune in boxing? And also, can I prove that MMA fighters can box, right? Or if he gets a big MMA fight, proving that there's a lot of money that can be made in mixed martial arts. So Francis Ngannou, I don't think this is the end of that story. The other possibility for next year, if PFL can find opponents for him, big opponents, can he reclaim the number one heavyweight position, the number one ranking under, I guess, number one ranking under independent ranking systems, because the promotions all have their own ranking now. So, he's never going to be the number one or champ in the UFC, but will will the media view him as the number one heavyweight? And if he fights a good enough opponent, looks great, depending on what John Jones does, he might reclaim that spot. But no matter what, he'll be the lineal champion going forward. So I think that's a big thing. The France Ngannou business is going to continue into next year, and that'll be something we'll all have to watch.
When you say, will the media rank him appropriately, did you use your heavy air quotes around media?
No, because I think some sites do a pretty good job. MMA Fighting has an independent ranking that does a fair job. SureDog does a decent job. Fight Matrix is an algorithm, so it's all based on the math. But the rest of the media, yeah, there is a question: will media sites appropriately rank them and discuss them? Right? Because there's a lot of sites that, we have to be honest, they're very, very friendly to the UFC because the UFC is the primary mover of business.
Yeah. What is the number 2 story we could be looking at next year?
People might notice a trend here, but the number 2 story is PFL Bellator.
Okay.
So it's very unoriginal, this list in many ways. But what we saw last year is going to come back to be big this year, some of it bigger. PFL Bellator will be interesting because they bought it. They made these splashes. Are they going to do anything next year, right? It's one thing to claim your number 2 and merge with Bellator and do all this stuff. They have a real uphill battle because the number one thing is they got to show that they're making revenue, right? They got to show that they're doing something because people didn't give them hundreds of millions of dollars just to put on events and lose money. They gave them hundreds of millions of dollars because they thought this would be a business that can make money in the future. So they have an ESPN deal. I don't know the full details of it. I imagine it's good for a second, the second place MMA promotion, but nothing like what the UFC is getting. So they have an ESPN deal that'll cover something, but they have to do pay-per-view. They've already said it. Pay-per-view is key. They have to put on pay-per-view events. Now they've done 2 and they've bombed because they had no one on them. But going forward, I guess the questions we got to look at, number 1 is, can they put on a pay-per-view event that sells? Now, they don't have to make money on that first 1 or 2 pay-per-view events. The point is, can they sell enough and then pay the fighters enough that where they don't lose their shirt, but also it's very enticing to other fighters. Like, wait a minute, I'm looking across the aisle and I see PFL putting on pay-per-views, and there seems to be a lot more money to be made for me, a fighter, if I fight with them. So I guess we will see if Ngannou can get an opponent and they can put on a pay-per-view that makes enough to pay him and his opponent enough that will raise the eyebrows of other fighters. If maybe Nate Diaz comes over, fights Jake Paul. Right now they only have kind of gimmicks to do, but can they get a consistent pay-per-view draw? Can they consistently put on some pay-per-view events? And can those pay-per-view events do enough to get fighters to come over? And then finally, the other thing is, can they do anything with Bellator, right? Because they have a Bellator package now to sell along with the PFL TV. Can they get TV? What will their TV rights for Bellator look like? And what will the Bellator events look like? So I'm going to be looking at all that. On top of that, I'm going to be looking at like live gate sales, if the ticket sales go up, if there's more interest in the promotion. So there's just so much to pay attention with what's going on with them. And that's not even talking about, will fighters continue to sign with them? Because there has not been, even though they've been throwing money around and talking about how much they're willing to pay fighters, UFC fighters specifically, there has not been a massive migration over there.
Well, it's kind of hard to when the UFC has everybody locked down.
That's exactly it. I mean, the point is PFL needs UFC fighters because UFC fighters are the most renowned right now. They need them to get the audience over, and then they can build up their own fighters at that point as soon as they get some UFC fighters, because those guys beat the UFC guys and look good. But they need those UFC fighters to kind of to kick it off, to be the lighter, to be the ignition, and they're not coming. And and that's the problem is, can UFC, even if the top UFC fighters want to go to PFL, can they? And if they can't, PFL's business model might be in trouble because their plan is dependent on getting a few fighters over there to get these pay-per-view events taking off.
Let's talk real quick before we move on to the number 1. I have to ask you more about Jake Paul, because there's a Google report that comes out every year that basically ranks their Google searches. And in combat sports and in sports in general, stick and ball sports too, he smoked everyone in combat sports, including boxing as a whole, UFC as a whole, and Conor McGregor. Now, when we get to the stick and ball sports, he wasn't at the top in any of the searches, but he was ranked anywhere from number 3 to number 8. And so I have to ask, how important to PFL is Jake Paul?
Well, I think he's important for the attention he gets, because that's what he does. He draws attention. But I don't think he's not super important. I mean, he's not. And the truth, when you look at the numbers for him, what he does in combat sports, he exaggerates profusely. He's not a major combat. He's a traction combat sports. He's even a star in MMA and boxing, I should say, although his audience has mostly been MMA fans. He's a star, but he's not a major star. He's not on the top of the sport. And he's also, I don't think, a star that has longevity, really, because he's based on attraction. So I don't know how important. He's important short term because he brings attention. He makes people think the PFL is doing something. But long term, he's much more of a better CM Punk figure with the UFC. Where the UFC got attention and everybody got kind of interested in seeing CM Punk fight the 2 times, and then it was over. Jake Paul has that, and there is some anticipation, and they keep bringing up that he's going to fight someone in MMA, but when is that going to happen? We have nothing booked yet, so I don't know when that's going to happen. So I don't think he's a major force, super important for PFL, but he lets them talk about them having the star. I also think his metrics are somewhat misleading. Yes, he probably outperforms all combat prize fighters and stuff, but that's partly because that's what he does. He's an attention seeker, right? He's constantly egging people up for attention, and he has a fan base that crosses out of mixed martial arts or combat sports into, teenagers about tons of different subjects. So I'm not sure I would read too much into that.
All right. So take us into our number 1 subject, which is obviously the antitrust suit.
Yes, the number 1 is the reverse, the antitrust. And the reason it was number 3 before is because we just had word that something's going to happen last year, and the anticipation alone made it number 3. But number 1 is because the potential here is so massive. We are going to have a trial in April, barring a settlement. There's a few motions that Zuffa has filed. Daubert reports that they're trying to get the experts excluded. I doubt that's going anywhere. We have a motion of summary judgment. The judge has already hinted that's not going anywhere. So all odds, unless there's a settlement, we will have a trial in April. And all indications too, it doesn't look like the UFC is going to settle. So we'll have a trial in April, and the potential here is huge because we'll have a trial. I would have to favor the plaintiff slightly because juries don't like corporations. And I've said before, you're going to present a regression model that Paul Gift doesn't think is really that good, but it doesn't matter because, it does matter, but I think most jurors are not going to be really up on regression math. It's going to be slightly over their head. So all the other stuff will take precedent over it, the precedent over it, and that'll be stuff like the emails and just the idea that these guys made tons of money and the fighters didn't make much. So I have to favor. It's not a slam dunk case. So you never know what's going to happen in a jury, but I have to favor the plaintiffs. So if it goes all the way through trial, there's so many possibilities can come out of. One is damages. If the jury awards them a large amount of damages and it's a jury trial, then it gets trebled. So those damages get tripled.
And it could be a little bit more than they ask for, according to Rob Mazy. He did answer our question about if they could award a little bit more than they were asking for. He said they couldn't get crazy and ask anything that wasn't already in discovery. I think that's how he put it, but that it could happen to a degree.
Yeah, I think my understanding is talking to other people is that they could ask for damages that have to do with the case itself that was presented, that maybe the model didn't incorporate, but they could say, listen, this is stuff that should be included in those damages. But they couldn't go, they couldn't say, we're going to award you just for pain and suffering, just for, we're not going to, for just penalizing the UFC for being jerks. We can't do anything like that.
Right.
So, but still, it could be a massive amount of damages coming out. So that'd be huge. And then it sets up the possibility of injunctive relief because after the trial, the judge will look at injunctive relief for the Kung Lee case only. But if there's injunctive relief on that, and the win on the damages, that sets up a precedent that's pretty strong for the Johnson case. The judge could be much harder on injunctive relief. Now, as much as damages could be huge too, there's the possibility, very strong possibility, not that the plaintiffs could lose, but coming out of trial, the UFC might decide to settle after the trial, after damages, because let's say the fighters win we're just gonna make up a number, $700 million, right? A large amount of money. Treble, that's a little over 2 billion, 2.1 billion. Well, at that point, UFC could say, listen, we want to talk to you about settling, because do you want to risk it on an appeal in the Supreme Court? We're willing to pay you a certain amount of money. And at that point, the plaintiffs might even be more susceptible to agreeing to a settlement, because now you have money on the table. Do you want to risk it on appeal? And because now you're looking at like it's the Price is Right, door number 1 or door number 2. Am I going to get the award? Am I going to go and appeal or the Supreme Court and they're going to shoot it down and we get nothing? So there's always the UFC might be deciding to look at settlement after the trial too. If the plaintiffs win, they might think it's in their best interest to see if we can win in trial, and if we lose, we can then try settling. So that is to say that nothing is clear cut this year. It's still going to be a process after the trial, but there is potentially, there's just a lot on the line. And I guess namely for fighters, if fighters who fought in the UFC, the number one thing is they potentially could get a check for a lot of money.
And that is awesome. And fighters have actually reached out to both of us with extreme interest in this case. So I think that's encouraging. Now, I do have a surprise fourth question for you, sir.
Fire, surprise. Oh, no, I don't do.
Oh, yes. It's a surprise in it. And it regards stories of this year and next year. I'm going to guess, and you can shoot this down or agree with it, but I'm going to guess that if we were to choose a fourth topic, that would be TKO Holdings.
Yeah, that was definitely my number 4. The only reason I didn't, because I don't think it's a big story, but it doesn't change the landscape like the others, because the UFC just keeps moving along on that one. But yeah, it's that would be like probably my 4th.
Awesome. So that's going to about wrap us up here. John, what do you have coming up on Bloody Elbow, on your other podcasts, whatever you have going until the end of the year? Now is your chance to tell us about that.
I have several articles. I don't know what date they're going to come out, what order, but one is I took the antitrust stuff and I went through and I compared event. I broke down an event, what the fighters are paid, what the UFC made on certain events during the class period. Another one, I look at Bellator's finances that were revealed in the class, in the discovery period. And then I have another one about, what a lot of boxers have complained this year about the problems in boxing. And I kind of offer my suggestion of a solution in another article.
That all sounds fantastic. And if y'all are like me, y'all are on pins and needles to read those. What other pods are you doing? Do you have anything going with If the Shoes Fit?
Well, I guess I have If the Shoes Fit, although I'll probably be off for the Christmas break for a couple of weeks. We just had another one. I also have the Show Money. We just recorded a new one, came out. And then of course there's a little thing called Hey Not the Face. But besides that podcast, and that's it. I have nothing else this year. Next year, as we look into next year, I'm hoping to make me and Jacob Debbitz are hoping our book will be done shortly into the new year at some point, and before the end of the year, hopefully it'll be out.
Awesome. So there you have it, folks. The predictions for next year and the recap of this year. We hope you all have happy holidays. We hope you all subscribe, and we hope you all stay safe until next year.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Okay, the face!